Welcome to the latest in the Adobe FrameMaker Essentials video series. In this session, I'll talk about migrating technical content from unstructured FrameMaker into DITA using Adobe FrameMaker. My name's Matt Sullivan, and I'm the owner of TechCom Tools. I've put together a lot of information for this session. Here's a quick overview of what we're going to cover. I'm going to start off talking about the target audience for this session. That means whether you are a Word to Frame user, or whether you are an existing FrameMaker user, or maybe whether you don't use Word or FrameMaker to create your content at all. After that, I'm going to talk about why paragraph-based content is different from structured content and how you are going to tell the difference, how you're going to move from one to the other, and what the advantages of those things are. I'm going to touch briefly on all the methods of conversion that you have available, and that's going to be what we're talking about in here today. That's a conversion table, or whether you should be using other services, software, or contractors for larger conversions to take advantage of scale. The main content for this session is going to be setting up a FrameMaker conversion table. We'll start with an initial table, and then we will build upon that, converting to see how it affects the content of our sample document or documents. As we get deeper into the conversion table, you're going to see similarities between things that exist in the FrameMaker element definition document and things that exist in the conversion table. Those are also things that if you're familiar with SGML and XML in general, including working with DTDs, these things will be a little bit more familiar. I'm going to touch on how you can deal with documents with complex content and what that means, what your options are as far as being able to split up a document or handle things in multiple different ways based upon your content model, in this case, DITA. And building on that document complexity, I'll show you how you can choose to take some documents to convert one way, some documents to convert the other way, and then depending on that document complexity, we'll talk about using split current document to make your document easier to understand for the conversion table and save you work in the conversion process. Once we get through that, I'll remind you where the Word to DITA recording is at that we looked at just a minute ago. Then I'll go over the content of that recorded session so you know exactly whether it's the right session for you to go watch. We're going to wrap up with a list of conversion resources, and that is both Adobe resources on their help system, along with developer guides, some of the books that I manage, and then education contractors and other things that can help you along this path of moving from unstructured FrameMaker into DITA with FrameMaker. I did leave a couple minutes for questions at the very end, so write those down, put them in the chat while I'm going through all this material. I'll be there to answer your questions, and if not, I look forward to addressing those things at the end or talking to you after this session. Finally, just to have it stated, this is an Adobe webinar. It is, of course, recorded. You will be sent the invite to watch the recording afterwards. So if you don't want to take notes on the material, write down the time within the presentation, and that'll give you a cheat sheet that you can use to go look at the recording later. For everyone that was on time for this session, please do me a favor when you see the inevitable comments in the chat about whether this is recording or whether we'll be sent the recording. Please just tell people you should have been here earlier because we already talked about it. Hope you have fun. I had a great time putting this presentation. Have a good time. The target audience for this session are current FrameMaker users working with unstructured content that need to move into editing the DITA content model using Adobe FrameMaker. And if you're not already a FrameMaker user, you'll get great content in this session, but you may want to consider checking out my earlier FrameMaker Essentials series video, Migrating Technical Content from Word into DITA with Adobe FrameMaker. That session has a little bit more background information about what DITA is and how you can use it once it's converted to push it into things like PDF and responsive HTML for mobile devices. At the end of this session, I'll give you a better understanding of what's in this earlier video so you can decide for yourself whether you want to go look that up and then watch the recording. If you're not already familiar, the first thing to understand about structured versus unstructured content is that in unstructured content, we're working with paragraphs. So if I go into a regular Word document, hopefully I have styles applied like title, heading 1, normal, and heading 2. As you might already know, a lot of times we'll end up with documents that are all based on normal, or what I call normal plus. They're normal plus additional formatting put on top of that, or what we call ad hoc formatting. Moving from content, which is normal plus ad hoc formatting, can be difficult, and that's whether you're working with Word, working with unstructured FrameMaker content, or from really any other source. It's those styles that we rely upon to identify the types of information that we're looking for, and to then convert that into the appropriate components within DITA and other structure models. And the same thing's true inside of FrameMaker. You can see that I'm using FrameMaker 17.0.7, which is the up-to-date version for the date that we've recorded this. And what I'm going to do is walk you through the template that I use to maintain a FrameMaker reference book called FrameMaker Working with Content. Just like Microsoft Word or properly styled Word documents, my content all has paragraph styles, in this case a paragraph tag or paragraph style called CT chapter title, B1 or body 1 paragraph style here, heading 1 here. This happens to be a style used only in front of a mini TOC or a chapter TOC, and so on. Here I've got one called Caution, and the interesting thing about these styles is that all of this formatting is independent of the content. So if I change this really quick, and I make it B1 body 1, all of the auto numbering, the graphics above and below, the pagination, and all those different properties that are stored in the paragraph style are removed, and this looks the same as another paragraph before or after. There's that same paragraph. If I apply the paragraph style again, I get that same thing. And that's really flexible inside of an unstructured editing environment. As FrameMaker users, we're incredibly fortunate to have a very robust template environment. If I go to the File menu, choose Import Formats, this dialog box right here shows me all the things that I can bring in from an unstructured template. Everything with a checkbox here, all of these things are things that can be pulled in from another document or from one document into my current document or book. It is important to note that we can leverage our knowledge about unstructured FrameMaker templates to apply formatting in multiple places inside of our DITA authoring environment. We'll see that a little bit later. Now let's take what we learned about unstructured content and paragraph-based styling, and let's see how it compares to structured content. It might be easier to look at a piece of content that is not in the DITA content model because this model matches a little bit more with the book and chapter and section paradigm that you might be used to with your documentation. In this document that I use for training in structured FrameMaker in general, we have content right here that's in an element that is a chapter element followed by a head element. Already we're seeing that we have context for our content. But the real difference is when we look at something called the structure view. Inside the structure view, we can see that this data communications text exists in something called a head element that is in turn inside of a chapter element. A chapter element might be part of a larger book project. And so it goes with the rest of the content. We have an intro section, we have paragraphs, lists, items, paras, and things that make maybe logical sense relative to what we're used to working in with paragraphs and with books. Our goal is to get our unstructured FrameMaker content into a specific model, the DITA content model. And DITA is a topic-based authoring system. When I switch over to DITA's equivalent of a book, and that is a DITA map, you can see that here I have the rules of 2024 Olympic men's basketball competition. That's the title of my overall document. And then I have a larger collection of files that make up a very simple project. If I open up one of those topics, and then I click inside of the topic itself, we see that this is one of the main DITA topic types. It is a concept topic, and that there is content that exists inside of that concept. The topic is already aware that it's part of this DITA map. It is the third topic in the list, therefore it gets an automatic number 3. You can also see that I have team fouls and a paragraph right here. And then I appear to have a subsection here, key differences from the NBA rules, but right now this looks as if it is not part of this topic right here. If I open up the key differences right here, while my DITA map will consider this as part of my overall project, you can see that this topic right here is a subset of the book here. So it's its own content. It's separate from everything else. It's an independent topic, and it's merely been referenced inside of this DITA map. Again, going back to more of a composite model where we have full chapters that are then collected into a book, topic-based authoring with a DITA map uses a much larger collection of smaller topics that can be used and reused as needed, and then those things are pushed through the DITA map into whatever output that we need, whether it's a PDF, HTML5, etc. So now we've seen how unstructured and structured content differ, and now we need to move from one to the other. We've got a number of different methods for conversion available, and mostly they differ by the type or source of the content and the amount of content that you need to convert. In my earlier session, we saw that when we have Microsoft Word content, when it's fairly well formatted with styles, and if we don't have an absolute ton of stuff to do, then we can go document by document and use the FrameMaker utility to convert that Word content into DITA topics. If you're a smaller organization, or if you just have a smaller amount of content to convert into DITA, then you can set up a conversion table to use directly inside of FrameMaker, bringing that styled paragraph-based content through the conversion table, ending up with DITA elements on the other side, and then you either complete the conversion table to tell FrameMaker what to do with the FrameMaker elements and how to put them in the right context, or you just manage that portion by hand. But what I'm going to show you doesn't exactly work for all organizations and for every amount of content. Really large content repositories would be difficult to convert by hand. And so at some point, you're going to look to either program your own conversion utilities via things like XSLT, or you're going to look at acquiring or contracting for commercial tools and utilities and people to do the conversion so that you can take those large swaths of content and get them converted and ready for use. In this session, we're going to focus on converting via a conversion table. And the first step in creating a conversion table couldn't be easier. Just take a document that you want to convert, go into the Element menu, down to Utilities, and generate conversion table. You've got the option to either generate a new conversion table or update an existing one. For now, because we're starting from scratch, we'll generate a new table. But each document can have different contexts and different types of information. So later, if our conversion table doesn't completely and accurately convert our content, we may take in other sample documents and then update the conversion table to scrape the document for other styles that we want to convert into specific DITA elements. I'll click on Generate, and I get this fairly simple looking table. I'm not surprised that the table is so short because in general, I try to develop templates that have very few paragraph styles and that work well together. I'll save this conversion table in a convenient place, and then I'll run this conversion table against my content. To do that, I come over to my content document, go to Structure, go to Utilities, and structure my current document. I choose the conversion table that I want. I've only got one available right now, and certainly I only have one open. And I click on Add Structure. The operation's completed normally, and you can see that now I have a document that looks exactly the same here, but it's actually a new document. This is my Untitled 2 document. So template ran through this table to come up with Untitled 2. And you can see in the structure view, I now have an element at the top. I have a chapter title, a crossref, and B1 Body 1. Now don't get too excited, because while I have a structured document, and it even has context for how things are embedded within the actual document, the names of these elements don't really mean anything. They're just converted over from the paragraph tags that were used before and then applied to this content. So there's some really good things like index markers that are converted automatically, graphics that retain their position and their formatting. But most of these things are things that we're going to remove with intent, because we don't want a structure model. We want to map to the DITA structure model. So we've got to take this stuff and say, look, rather than these named elements, we need named elements that match our content model inside of DITA. That's where knowledge of DITA is going to come in handy. So if you don't already have that experience, you're probably going to want to have at least a list of the elements that are used inside of DITA. And in the resources that I share at the end of the session, I'll give you 1 or 2 books that I'd recommend that you have on hand so that you can better understand the DITA content model. So as I said before, this does not conform to the DITA model. At this point, you're going to have something to look at, to emulate, to get the names and to get the elements that you need to get your content in the right format. So I just came in and said File, New, DITA, Concept. And then from here, with this little straw man skeleton here, I built this out as a regular topic. After conversion, I'll get rid of this one. Or rather, after filling in the content, I end up with something that is the same content that I had before. It looks a little different. It's certainly formatted differently. And I also dropped some of the stuff that we don't need to deal with at this point, some of the graphics and the cross-references and things like that. So we're going to address first the bulk of our content, and then we're just going to kind of narrow down from that 100% needed to be converted to 50%, to 30%, to 10%. And at some point, you'll find that converting by hand may be faster than trying to continue to optimize the process. So when your development time exceeds your hand conversion time, then you just kind of say, all right, well, I've got to go in and wrap some of this stuff by hand. So here we go. Here's our concept. It's got a title. The title has a short description. So I had to rewrite this rather than the way that it was before. We had in the template, we had these paragraphs right in here and a graphic, and those aren't appropriate for a short description. Now, the reason that's important is you should understand that your content is certainly not likely to be already written in a style that fits the DITA content model. So in some cases, you're going to have to go in like I did and take a paragraph of text, run it through your favorite large language model, and come up with a summary for a short description. And then you can see that some of this information might be slightly repeated in other stuff down below. But you're going to come up with a method to take your existing content, put it into the DITA content model, and either remove things that are unneeded or unsupported, or add things that are necessary but weren't present in your content. Most certainly, you'll have to change the order of many things to fit what your content model now requires you to do. So that's a short description, and you can see also that there's an italics element in here, and that was a character style that I had put into FrameMaker, and that character style needs to be addressed. So I want to wrap that in some sort of element, and then later I can take my templates and make it look more or less like what I had. I've got choices at that point because my formatting is separated from my content. And just to be clear, I only did that wrapping of the character styles in this first section right in here rather than everything that existed in here. It got a little bit repetitive there. So my concept body, or my con body, is made up of a series of paragraphs. Those paragraphs have character styling applied to it. And then I've got paragraph, paragraph, paragraph. When I get down into other areas, I've got different content types. So when I get down in here, within this section, I've got a title and a paragraph. That's this section right in here. And this actually was a mistake on my part. So this one, I'll go ahead and fix this right now. Be good for you to see. I'm going to move that up into the section above. There's no visible change right in here, but you can see that there's a significant change in how it's all grouped together. So context is very important. I didn't want to have that. It didn't make any sense to have that as a separate section. So I'll go ahead and do that. My ordered lists, or my OLs, contain list items, or LIs. Each one of those LIs has a text range in it, effectively one sentence or one paragraph of text. And then it just continues on like that. Now that we've got something in here that tells us or informs us what we need to have when we're doing a concept topic, I can go in and start mapping the elements that are used within my content model to specific paragraph styles and other things inside of my conversion table. All right, with that sample concept topic, we now have the last thing we need before we start the actual conversion and writing and testing of this process. The three things that we've done so far, we've identified one or more sample documents for conversion. In this case, we're using the template from my workbook file. We've scraped that sample file to come up with a basic conversion table. And then we've either created or identified some sample docs that conform to the content model that we need to convert into. So here we have our sample document, our base conversion table, and our document that conforms to the content model that we need. Remember that we also have this converted document. And while this one has lots of interesting information, seems to be pretty well formatted, this basically is just something we're going to iterate, and we're going to come up with untitled documents when we do this conversion. There's really no reason to save these until the final finished product that is a result of your proper full conversion table. So I'm going to go ahead and delete untitled 5. And I expect that I'm going to get a lot more of those untitled files as we go. So just recognize that they're going to increment up as we develop. Back over into the conversion table. We're now going to take each one of these things and we're going to identify the paragraph, starting with the paragraphs, the paragraph that is in use, and then what element should wrap that content. Looking at our sample from the content model, we see that a concept title is literally wrapped inside of a title. So we'll go over to the title, which is object styles, and say that that CT chapter title is going to be wrapped into an element, which the name's already there, so I can just select and wrap it in a title. We'll find that we use this qualifier column quite a bit when we're doing our conversion development. For right now, I'm going to ignore that and just kind of go forward and then come back and fill in, explain what this is and what we need to do with it. Next would be my B1 body 1 paragraph. So if I look at my sample doc, my regular paragraphs are going to get wrapped into P elements. Maybe not much of a surprise there. And I just noticed that for title, I actually want that to be lowercase, just the way it's going to be in here. Now, when I come down to my creating object styles, which is also a title element in my sample document, I go over to my sample doc. Creating object styles is an H1 heading 1. So I go into the table and I say that H1 heading 1s, these will also be turned into a title. We'll do one more thing and then we'll do a conversion. Looking at this content here, This paragraph is going to get wrapped in an LI, or a list item element. So we're going to come in and look at this paragraph style, which I know is my ordered list, and we will convert the OL-ordered list into an LI element. That's good for now, so I'll save this, come back over to my sample document, and then we'll run our conversion on this document again. So we go to Structure, Utilities, Structure Current Document. We've still got our conversion table selected, and we're going to add structure. Completed normally, we hit OK. Looking at Untitled 7, we can see that we've got some progress. I do have a title element. My title element has object styles in it. I then have a series of P elements. And you can see that I've got a graphic, which isn't really being managed with our conversion table yet. And we also have this mini TOC, which has a bunch of stuff that we're not really managing in through here. So this is getting a little bit confusing. We're going to pull this out in just a second and reconvert. This section title right here is actually containing this hypertext for the mini TOC. A tip that we're going to have to manage a series of paragraphs. But I want to get down in particular to the list items. So I do have list items, but you can see they're just listed as individual paragraphs. They're not collected into any sort of unit like an ordered list. So we're going to manage that in just a bit as well. We've got my body keep with next, and so on down the road. Let's do a little bit more prep inside of our template, and then we're going to run this again. So for my template file, which is my sample document, I'm going to pull out this graphic right here. I'm going to select the mini TOC right here and pull out this graphic right here. We can always come back and test for graphics and other things later, but we don't need those right now. We're just going to try and get a document that is kind of straightforward and simple first, and then we'll build upon that. I'll save my sample document real quick. And then I'll address a couple more things inside of my conversion table and reconvert and evaluate. In here, I saw that my caution paragraphs probably just going to be a paragraph of a certain type inside of DITA. Same thing with my tips. My heading 2s are going to be titles of a certain type. And my body keep next paragraph, that's also going to be just a regular paragraph. There's no need to save this, but I'll save it just to make sure it's on disk the way that I want it. I'm going to go ahead and close out of my untitled test file here without saving. And that lets me come back over to template. And you can see that I'm probably going to go to the structure menu to run this utility a number of times. So I tend to use a keyboard shortcut in there. So instead of going to the structure menu item, I like to hit the Alt key. So it's Alt S, L, S, and then I can hit return. Operation completed normally. I've got my no name, I've got my title, my P. You can see things are starting to come together here. I do still have a mini talk element right here. You can see that that is just a heading right there, so I can either choose to delete that or just push it into a regular P paragraph. Scrolling through the document, I do have this graphic down at the end. I'm going to pull that out of my test file. And the thing that stands out to me right now are these character styles that I've got for menu and key. We'll go ahead and close out of our converted file. Back over to the conversion table. And I can handle my character tags basically the same way that I handle my paragraph tags. I'm going to come up with an element that I want to indicate that something should be a menu item. And in this case, for a menu character tag, inside of DITA, I've got more choices than just bold or italic. I can actually choose an individual element that was designed to represent this content. That's because DITA was developed in order to document software and software practices. So if I come in here and take off the simple mapping that I did before, I'll just go ahead and unwrap. With that text selected, I'm going to go over to my elements, and I'm going to use something called Win Title. So I'm going to select that and then wrap it by double-clicking. And we can see that there is specific formatting associated with the Win Title. I can choose that default formatting from within FrameMaker, or I can choose to edit the templates that display my data and then display this inside of my published HTML and PDF in a different way later. I do cover a little bit more of that formatting and template work in the previous webinar, so make sure you check that out as well. Let's do the same sort of thing with my italic element here. I'm going to go ahead and right-click so I can unwrap that. With that text selected, I'm going to come up to my elements. I'm just going to type in the element that I know or that I need. In this case, I'm going to do term. And I have an exact element called term that comes up. I'll double click on that to wrap it. And we can see that these two elements, the object styles and the object catalog, are formatted the same, but that's okay. When you look under the hood, when you look in the structure view, you can see that the term has one type of content, and that Win Title is a different type of content, even though they're formatted the same way. So that's where we go with those templates, and we make those changes later down the road. We've separated the formatting from the content. We can address the formatting independently of the editing and the creation of the content. I'm going to unwrap my bold element here, and then choose an element specifically designed to display the choice within a dialog or a panel. And in this case, this will be a UI control. As with any system, these things are going to get easier as you go along because you will do the research. You'll figure out what it is that you want to use specifically. After you look at the reference, you look at your LLM, you look at whatever you need to get that element, then you come back in and you apply that to your content. And that in turn allows you to add it to the automatic translation or the automatic conversion via the conversion table. And working on those three is probably enough right now. So let's make some changes to the conversion table and then reconvert and see where we're at. Coming down in here, you can see that I've got 3 different character tags in this list. They are emphasis, menu, and control. Emphasis is going to be turned into a term. Menu converted to a Win Title. And you can see some shades of DITA coming in here already. UI control, character tag is going to be set to UI control. Save that just so I have a backup. Come back over to my content document. Use my shortcut, which is Alt-S, L-S. Hit Enter. And then review. Title, P, term. You can see that my term is already applied. Object Style Designer is now a Win Title. Object Catalog is a Win Title. Those are both the titles of panels, so those are correctly mapped so far. But if I come down to below current baseline, and I come down to add insertion point, these are values inside of the document and they are not titles of panels or dialogues. So this is not properly mapped right now, and that's okay. We've got it somewhat converted. We can figure out ways to identify these things so that they will be isolated and then we can further process them down the line. But since these are fairly close within the document itself, I want to look at my Win Title, something properly set as a Win Title, and something that is set to go to Win Title even though it's a UI control. So Object Catalog and below current baseline are posing a problem for me right now. If I go back to the template and I look at Object Catalog, that's got a menu character tag on it, and then below current baseline, that's got the same menu character tag. I can see that right down here. As I mentioned earlier, your content probably isn't written for DITA. So it's not surprising that the ways that we need to split or fork our information are not perfectly aligning with DITA. So you are probably going to have to go through your content, as I would have to in this case, and create another character style for below current baseline that differs from the one that I'm using for my win title, the object catalog. For now, I'm just going to leave that as is, and I'm going to make it a future project down the line. Next up, we're going to do a little housekeeping, and then I want to go into identifying the elements that need to be wrapped and starting to create the nesting and the contextual information that we need. I had a couple of things that I want to delete out of my sample test file. So I'm going to get rid of that paragraph right there. And also get rid of this graphic just so we're not looking at it as it converts each time. Save my test file. And then come back over to my conversion table. For me, the most gratifying part about this whole process is seeing the rules that we put in that then create the context and the nesting of these elements. And we're going to have two things that are going to help us do that. The first is this qualifier column. And the qualifier column allows me to identify the content that I'm putting in here so that I can treat it separately in different contexts. So while I have a number of things that are creating titles, if I have a title, which is, for instance, con title, section, and subsection, I can now uniquely identify those things later and treat them independent of each other. I can also change my mind later, change up these labels and then the rules that follow without any problem. So I can kind of take guesses at these things, develop it, and then see how it goes. Now that I've identified different types of headings, I'm going to start to put together larger elements that will contain the title in this case, and then the elements that follow. I'm going to come into my table, add a new row, and the most obvious element that I don't have identified yet is concept. So let's see what happens here. We're going to come in and we're going to say in the conversion table, if I have an element called title, and that title element is a con title, I want to wrap that thing in something called a concept. Another large component of my concept topic is going to be my con body. If I add another row to the table, what I want to do is collect elements that are P elements into a container element called con body. But I don't want to wrap every paragraph inside of a con body. So what I want to do here is say that if I have more than one paragraph, and for now I'll indicate that with a plus sign. If I have a collection of P elements in a row, then I'm going to wrap those things inside of a con body. At the same time, I also recognize that inside of my concept element, I've got this short desk and a con body is part of a concept. So how am I going to manage all of these right here? I've got the title of type con title that's going to be wrapped into a concept, and I want to also address for or account for the short desk and for a con body and wrap that entire thing into the concept topic. What I want to do here is use occurrence indicators short desk, and then I'm going to type in con body. Now I'm going to circle back in a minute and kind of explain where some of these occurrence indicators came from and how you can figure them out on your own or get a reference for that. But for now, what I'm going to do is say that my short desk is an optional element, and the indicator for that's going to be a question mark. That should do for now, so I'll go ahead and save. Go back to my sample document. I'll convert that document, this time just going through the menu structure to remind you that we're going down to this one right here. There also is an escape key sequence that you can use to structure that current document. Those are always good. Depends on whether you like to use Alt key and Control key shortcuts, or whether you like escape key sequences. They're a little bit different, but they act the same. I'll structure the current document. It completes normally, and I end up with an untitled 10. Now check this out. We've got our concept. The concept contains a title. That title is object styles. That's good. We don't have anything that specifically converts to the short desk from our sample document, so that optional, that question mark that I put in there came in handy. It's not there, so it's not going to stop or kill the conversion or the collection of this information. So now we've got the title, and then we've got one or more paras, in this case 3-4 paras in a row, that are wrapped into a con body. Now there's some other things going on clearly. We've got titles and con bodies here. We certainly don't want each of these to be a separate chapter, but for right now, we've got a base nesting of this information, and at a minimum, this is a tiny little concept topic. So we feel good about this. So at this point, this seems really promising. Now let's go back to the conversion table and figure out what it is that we actually did. I snuck a couple of things in about these last couple of rules that you may not have been familiar with. A lot of the conventions that are coming in with these conversion tables are things that are from what is allowable in a FrameMaker element definition document, or EDD. What that means for you is that if you want to understand how these things work, how they're identified, and how to manipulate them, understanding of the EDD is an important thing. One of the things that I'll show you in the resources section at the end of this presentation is how to get a copy of Adobe's documentation on EDDs and on developer information. Along with that information, I've got a much more concise, exercise-driven workbook that shows you how to work with EDD development, and the last chapter in that workbook is how to write a conversion table, and it explains everything that we're doing right in here. The brackets, the elements, the qualifiers, and how we put together all of these elements and their order so that you can come up with a converted doc. It's one of the 2 structured FrameMaker workbooks that I produce and keep up to date to run both my courses and my classes, and they are both available as independent book purchases as well. Getting back into solving the problems with converting this document, I'm going to come over to my unstructured content, structure it with Alt-S, L-S, and now I'm going to start figuring out where my rules are breaking and how I might modify them to make them more inclusive and more exact. I get the con body the way that I want, but I also want to include this title. And when I take a peek at my content model example, I see that I need to have a title which is wrapped in a section in order to recover that information. So I'm going to have to come back to my conversion table and put in a new row that will catch my title elements, the ones that have a section qualifier. We'll test that. I've got my concept, I've got my con body, and now I've got my section. Back over in the rules, I'm going to need to open up this area right here by allowing for sections. And again, the occurrence indicators are very important here. This rule, as I've written it, says take 1 or more paragraphs in a row, followed by exactly 1 section, and wrap it in a con body. And that would be great, except I already know that I have multiple sections that are siblings. So when I come over here and get a bunch of different sections, or rather if I look at my sample content here, my con body needs to allow for 4 paragraphs in a row and multiple sections in a row. So what I need to do within my rule is to give it the appropriate occurrence indicator. Now I may have chapters in my FrameMaker files that don't have sections in them at all. So I'm going to use an indicator which is 0 or more. So the asterisk means I can have 0 or more sections in a row, and those will be wrapped by a con body. Flip over to my sample, Alt-S-L-S, looking at my con body. I've now got that first section in there right there, but then it looks like I have a P element in between the things that we're doing here. So this is sucked in one section, but not all of them. So this is great that you can see that we're making progress. And at the same time, you can also see that subtle differences in your content and the way things are presented for conversion can make a big difference. I can certainly continue along in this manner and get something that will fully convert this document. But if I don't have time for that, I can also attack it in different ways. So let's take a look at how some of those might help this conversion right here. We've seen that one of the things that throws a wrench in our conversion is the different ways that we might put together a content document. The more complex the document, the harder to come up with rules to address all of those options or possibilities. At the same time, we want to recognize that DITA in itself is a simple topic-based environment where we string together lots of little things rather than having one big complex thing. So if our documents are complex, it might be beneficial to break those documents down into smaller chunks. In fact, when you look at the DITA content model, our DITA topics are not intended to be full of sections and subsections. They're meant to be smaller things that have connections to other smaller things, and then they build up into a larger project. So it's not surprising in our previous example that in our chapter that had heading level 2 and heading level 3 sections, we started to run into difficulty when we saw those different things happening. There is really no great way to display a third level heading inside of a DITA topic. Instead, we want a higher level topic with child topics, and then with additional child topics, and then we can nest as deeply as we want without worrying about all of these different iterations. Fortunately, the last couple versions of FrameMaker, they ship with a utility to do exactly what we need. I am a fan of this utility. However, there are a few things that you need to be aware of when you use it. A couple edges that you want to make sure you get set correctly before you do the processing. The first thing that helps me is to set a location. In this case, I've created a separate folder called Split that's going to hold the processed information from my file. I find it's a good idea to replace white space and to get rid of special characters in the file names. And then the obvious is I'm going to go in and identify those things that will create a split within my doc. I want to change this file name. That might just be superstition, but I think it might be necessary in order to get the book to process properly. We're going to rename that book because that doesn't take place until you actually hit the rename right there. And then we're going to start the split. I do get a message because it doesn't find the marker that I'd set earlier. I also get a message saying that it had an error opening the book. Now the reason for the error opening the book is that the book file actually comes through and processes as template-split.txt. If I change that manually to book, come back into FrameMaker, and then open up my renamed book, I get a book file. I have a series of files that have been processed and split out, which is fantastic. And each of these is about the amount of content that I would want to have in a DITA topic. So basically, if you have a complex sample document, that complex sample document is great for doing the individual mapping to specific DITA elements. It gives you everything in one big collection. However, once you start looking to give context and to give it depth of content here, a long complex chapter is best split up into a series of things that can be more easily converted. Let's take a look now at what our conversion looks like. So we come to Object Styles, go through and convert, so Alt-S-L-S, enter. Operation completed normally, and we end up with basically a valid DITA concept topic. Look at my next file, a case for using object styles, run my conversion, and we can see that this one, because it was converted into a section and not into a topic, means that we need to rewrite our conversion rules. That's easy enough. I'm going to move this over here just to get some space. Looking at my conversion table, this conversion table is for a more complex book. So perhaps I want to take this convert TechCom Tools content and do a save as. Rename this so it's convert simple content to DITA. And instead of making H1 heading 1 paragraphs, titles with a qualifier of section, I'll also make this con title. I'll do the same thing with my heading 2s. We'll save that. Go back to a case for using object styles. Remember, this is my unstructured document right here. Alt-S, LS. This time, make sure that your conversion table document is indeed the simple content, and add structure. The operation completes normally, and we end up with a full, basically valid DITA concept. Keeping in mind, you might have thousands of these little files that you've converted and split out, and all of them may work perfectly with a conversion table. You don't want to have to do those one by one. So if you come into Structure, go to Utilities, and Structure Documents rather than just the current document, your conversion table will be Convert Simple Content. The input directory will be this split folder. We'll create a new directory for the output and add structure. Opening up all the files in the book, we can see that there's still some work to do, but also that a whole lot of this conversion is already complete. This one seems fine. We need to deal with graphics, which wasn't part of some of our other documents. We still do need to look at list items and collect those into ordered lists, and then make those valid within a con body. And there's probably a couple other things in there that you have to finish off. And that takes us about as far as we want to go with the conversion using the conversion table here in Adobe FrameMaker. If you've got a light amount of content, this is going to get you where you need to go. If you've got more content than you can handle with what you've seen here, you may want to consider getting a little education or partnering with somebody to help you with the conversion process itself. Of course, I'd be happy to help you with that, and there'll be some contact info in just a moment. I know this topic is deep, so I promised Stefan that I'd try and wrap up just a couple minutes early in order to leave you a little bit of time for questions. So I do hope you've got some good ones, and I want you to put them in the chat while I go through a couple of things. This information is going to be fast enough that you're probably going to have to go back to the recording to catch a lot of it if it's of interest to you. And you might also want to have your phone or your screen capture utility handy, because I've got a couple of QR codes and web addresses that you'll be interested in. To start, I want you to know what we covered in the previous Word to DITA session. It was kind of cool in that session because the Word to DITA is simple enough that it didn't require the entire time that we needed. So we threw a couple other things in there, including the options for controlling the output of a topic versus a DITA map to PDF. Those can look vastly different, and you do have control over each. I walked through what a structured application is and some of the things that you can do with it. And then we talked about how to do custom branding on the DITA output templates that are part of your default FrameMaker installation. We did a walkthrough of the differences between a book map and a DITA map inside of FrameMaker. And we wrapped up with options for publishing HTML5 for responsive and mobile. As promised throughout the presentation, here are a list of some resources for you. First off, the FrameMaker Structured Application Developer's Guide. You can get it at that very, very long address. Take a picture of it if you need, or you can search on the title, FrameMaker Structured Application Developer's Guide, and you'll get a link to help.adobe.com. If you're interested in picking up any of the workbooks or the reference books that I mentioned in the session, you can get there from learn.techcomtools.com. And if you're sitting there right now wondering where you go from here, you know you've got a project that you need to work on, please reach out at mattconsult.youcanbook.me, and I will sit down with you for half an hour and we can figure out a game plan for you. The conversion material that we worked on today, the conversion table itself, this was part of the Formatting Structured Content, or the EDD course that I have online at courses.techcomtools.com. And we're not done yet. You can go to community.adobe.com, find this little checkbox for technical communication and e-learning to get to FrameMaker, RoboHelp Captivate, and even Learning Manager and AEM community help. If you're on the FrameMaker site, you may see a couple of responses from me. And if you're not watching this today as part of the Adobe webinar broadcast, you're probably already on YouTube at the Adobe TCS site. All of the webinars that I do, as well as the entire FrameMaker series, all of the DITA World recordings, and the new featured videos that I do for Adobe, these are all listed here. You can find many topics that'll help you understand how to move about through FrameMaker. With any luck, and if history is an indicator, Stefan and I will both be hosting the DITA World 2026 conference. That's a 3-day online Adobe event. Fantastic information with case studies and ways to use FrameMaker and Adobe Experience Manager. And it is truly a don't miss for DITA professionals, so you understand what's happening in the world of DITA, in AI, and in content management. Plus, this year, I think you'll agree, they have the best banner they have ever had. And finally, to wrap up, just a couple of my pieces of contact information and a slide to sit on while we answer a couple of questions. I do hope you enjoyed the session. I certainly did enjoy putting it together for you.